For the worthy part 1, the dead tree Sable Ashford had $4.37 to her name, a candle stub with maybe 30 minutes of light left in it, and a piece of paper pressed against her ribs that said she was worth $410 million. She was sitting under an overpass at the junction of Route 9 and the county road with her back against a concrete column and her knees drawn up and the cold coming through the cardboard beneath her in that deep, specific way that cold comes when you have been sleeping on the ground for 11 days. The kind of cold that packs itself into your joints like gravel and stays there even after you stand up. She had found the envelope 3 hours ago, nailed to a dead tree on a road nobody drove on, sealed with red wax that had cracked in 2 places but still held. 3 words on the front in handwriting so old it looked like it belonged to a different century. For the worthy. She had broken the seal by candlelight. She had read the letter twice. She had read the number at the bottom of the deed 3 times because numbers that large do not register the first time or the second. They sit on the page like something written in a language you almost speak but not quite. She did not cry. She had stopped crying at things that deserved crying the same year she stopped shaking, which was the year she learned that both cost energy she could not afford. She made a list instead. It was the kind of list her grandmother would have made. Practical, sequential, stripped of hope because hope was a luxury, and what she needed right now was logic. 1. Was this real? 2. If it was real, why had no one else found it? 3. If she walked into a law office looking the way she currently looked, which was like a woman who had been sleeping in a drainage ditch for 11 days, would they take her seriously? 4. What happened to someone who tried to claim something this large and got it wrong? She did not answer any of the questions that night. She folded the papers back into the envelope, tucked the envelope inside her jacket against her ribs where the warmth of her body would keep it dry, and lay down on the cardboard she used for insulation. And she looked up at the underside of the road above her and she thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother's name had been Ruth. Not Ruth Crane, Ruth Ashford, because the Crane name had been lost a generation back through marriage and then lost further through a family that did not keep records, did not keep in touch, did not keep much of anything except a low-level suspicion that they had once been connected to something they could not name. Ruth had mentioned it once. Sable was maybe 9. They were eating soup that was mostly broth at the kitchen table in the apartment on Sycamore Street, the one with the radiator that clanked every 40 seconds through winter. And Ruth had said in the particular way she said things she thought were too important for conversation, that the Crane blood ran in them, and the Crane blood was proud blood, stubborn blood, the kind that did not ask for things because it did not need to. Then she had gone back to her soup. Sable had been 9 and had filed it away without understanding it. Words that sit in the back of your mind for years, waiting for a season that has not arrived yet. She was 23 now and lying in an underpass with $410 million pressed against her ribs. And the season had arrived. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay there and thought about the chain of events that had brought her to a piece of cardboard under a highway overpass in a county she had never planned to visit. Before the drainage ditch, there had been the church shelter in Bridger Falls. She had been there for 3 weeks. It was not a good place, but it was a place which was the standard she had learned to measure by. A cot, a ceiling, a door between her and the weather. Then 3 families came in from a flooded trailer park on a Thursday afternoon, 8 adults and 11 children. The number stopped working in her favor, and she was the one asked to leave because she was young and single and had no children, and the calculus of need placed her at the bottom of a list she had not known she was on. Before the shelter, there had been Wade. Wade, who had seemed kind for about 6 weeks before he stopped being kind in the particular way some men stop, all at once, like a switch. One evening she was a person he spoke to with warmth, and the next morning she was a person he spoke to as though she had broken something he could not name. She had left his apartment in Kolberg with 1 bag and the $4.37 she had hidden in a sock because she had learned early to always hide a small amount of money in a place a man would not think to look. Before Wade, there had been the food processing plant. $11 an hour, the smell of rendered fat soaked into her clothes so deeply that she could smell it in her sleep. Fluorescent light for 8 hours a day. A supervisor who called everyone sweetheart and did not mean it kindly. She had lasted 11 months before the plant closed without notice on a Tuesday, and she was on the street by Friday because the room she rented cost more than one missed paycheck could absorb. Before the plant, there had been a woman named Phyllis who rented her a room in a house with 6 other women, and a policy about no personal items left in the bathroom. Phyllis had raised the rent without notice and without apology, the way landlords raise rent on people who have no other options, with the casual certainty that the person will pay because the alternative is the street. Sable had paid for 2 months, then she could not pay, and Phyllis had been efficient about the rest. She was 23 years old. She looked 40 in the eyes, not because the years had been unkind in the way that breaks a face, but because they had been educational in the way that quiets one. Her eyes held the particular stillness of someone who had learned to watch everything and react to nothing until she had decided what the reaction should be. This was the person who had walked past the dead tree on Ridgemont Road on the 11th day of sleeping in a drainage ditch and had stopped. Most people who walked the back edge of Ridgemont Road did not look at that tree twice. It was just a dead tree at the end of a dead stretch of land that nobody claimed and nobody wanted. The bark had gone gray and papery, the branches stripped bare. The roots had buckled the earth at its base into a pattern of cracked ridges, like something old and stubborn, refusing to let go of the ground even after everything else had given up on it. Half swallowed by undergrowth on one side and pressed against a rusted wire fence on the other, the kind of fence that existed not to keep anything in but to let the world know that someone at some point had cared enough to draw a line. Sable stopped in front of that tree, slow and careful, moving with the particular attention of someone whose whole life had taught her that rushing past things leads to stepping on the wrong piece of ground. She was short, 5'2", and she had a habit of looking at things from odd angles because odd angles were where she had learned the world kept its surprises. She saw the corner of it first. Just a pale triangle peeking out from beneath a strip of bark that had curled away from the wood like a lip pulling back. Her brain registered paper before she consciously understood what she was looking at. She pulled the bark aside. The envelope was old. That much was obvious. The kind of yellow that takes years, not months. But it had been wrapped in something, some kind of waxed cloth now blackened and stiff, and the wrapping had done its job. The paper beneath was intact. The envelope was sealed, not glued, sealed with red wax that had cracked in 2 places but still held the flap down. Across the front, in handwriting so old it looked like something from a different century, 3 words in faded ink: for the worthy. She had not known what she was holding. She had not understood that the dead tree at the edge of a road nobody drove on had been keeping something for 37 years and had just given it to her. She only knew that it was paper and it was sealed and it was not trash and it was not nothing. She had taken it to the underpass and broken the seal by candlelight, and the world had changed without making a sound. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter 4 pages long, written in the same formal hand as the front of the envelope, with a date at the top that she read 3 times before she believed what she was seeing. The second was a folded document, heavier stock, official looking, with a gold embossed seal in the top left corner. She read the letter first. It began with a name she had never heard in her life, Edmund Aldrich Crane. It began with his name, and then it explained who he was. And by the end of the first paragraph, her hand was not shaking, which seemed wrong because her hand should have been shaking given what she was reading. But her hands had stopped doing that a long time ago, the same year she stopped crying at things that deserved crying. Edmund Aldrich Crane had been her great-great-uncle. He had died in 1987. He had been born in 1899. He had lived for most of his adult life on an estate called Crane Hollow, which sat on 412 acres of land in the hill country above Harmon County, and which contained a main house, 3 outbuildings, a working well, a spring-fed pond, a timber stand, worth what the letter estimated as a significant sum, and a subsurface mineral lease arrangement that had been generating revenue into a trust's account for over 30 years. The letter was written by a man named Aldous Pemberton, who identified himself as Edmund's attorney and who had drafted the letter in 1986, the year before Edmund died, at Edmund's direct instruction. The letter explained that Edmund had no children, that his brothers had produced children and those children had produced children, but that Edmund had watched the family fracture along lines of money and resentment until he could no longer trust that any of the obvious heirs deserved what he had built. He had written the estate into a specific trust with a specific condition. The deed would not transfer through standard probate. It would wait. It would wait in an envelope on a dead tree at the edge of his land for someone who found it. Not because they were looking for it, but because they were the kind of person who looked at things from the right angle. "I have no way of knowing who will find this," the letter said in Pemberton's careful penmanship recording Edmund's exact words. "I have no way of knowing when, but I have spent 87 years learning that the right person for any task is not always the loudest or the most connected or the one already standing in the room. Sometimes the right person is standing outside in the cold looking up at something everyone else walked past. If you are reading this, you were paying attention when others were not. That is enough. That is, in my experience, everything." The document was a deed of title, the deed of title to Crane Hollow. The property transferred per the terms of the Edmund Aldrich Crane Perpetual Trust to the bearer upon presentation of this document and the accompanying letter to the office of Blackwell and Associates Attorneys at Law, 44 Meridian Street, Armagh County, with any associate of the firm acting as administering trustee upon Pemberton's death. The value line at the bottom of the deed, filled in by hand, read $410 million with a note beneath it that the figure was a 2019 appraisal and that current market valuation should be sought at time of transfer. $410 million. Now she lay on the cardboard with the letter and the deed pressed against her ribs, and she did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed about the tree. In the dream, it was alive, green and enormous, the kind of tree that belonged in a painting rather than at the edge of a county road in Harmon County. And she was standing at the base of it, looking up through the branches at the lights she could not reach. And the bark under her hands was warm. She woke before dawn with the cold settled deep into her bones. She sat up, checked inside her jacket. The envelope was there. Checked the $4.37 in the tin box wedged between the column and the support beam, still there. She needed to think before she walked into that law office. And she needed to think carefully, because the problem with $410 million is that it attracts attention the moment you mention it, and attention is not always the kind that helps you. Sable had learned this about smaller amounts of money, much smaller. She had watched a woman at the shelter in Bridger Falls whisper about winning $300 on a scratch ticket, and by the end of the week, 2 people had borrowed against it, and one person had started a rumor that the amount was higher and the $300 was gone before it could be cashed. $300. Eaten alive by the simple act of being mentioned. She was sitting on $410 million, and she did not have a phone, a working address, a government ID that was not expired, or a single person in Harmon County who knew her name. That was either a problem or an advantage. She spent 2 days deciding which. She spent those 2 days in the public library, which opened at 9 and closed at 6, and had bathrooms where she could wash her face, and the children's section in the back corner where nobody bothered you if you were quiet and reading, which she was. She read about estate law. She read about perpetual trusts. She read about adverse possession and deed transfer, and the specific legal mechanisms by which property changed hands in situations that were not standard. She read carefully and she read slowly because she had learned a long time ago that the difference between understanding something and thinking you understood something was usually the difference between reading it once and reading it 3 times. By the end of the second day, she understood enough to know 3 things. The trust, if it was real, was built on a mechanism that was unusual but not unprecedented. There were documented cases of delayed transfer trusts with bearer deed conditions, mostly from the early and mid 20th century, mostly from wealthy eccentrics who had complicated feelings about their heirs. The law office address 44 Meridian Street existed. She found it in an old county business directory from 2009. Blackwell and Associates established 1952. Whether it still existed, she did not know. 2009 was a long time ago, and Aldous Pemberton had been drafting documents for a man who was already 87 in 1986, which meant Pemberton was almost certainly dead, which the letter had anticipated, which was why it said any associate of the firm. And the third thing she understood was this: she could not afford to wait. Every day she spent in the drainage ditch was a day the envelope could be damaged or lost or stolen or discovered by someone who would not handle it correctly. The document was 37 years old. It had survived because of wax cloth and a dead tree and the specific indifference of a road nobody walked. But survival had limits. And so did she. She went to 44 Meridian Street on a Thursday morning. She had washed her hair in the library bathroom the night before using the hand soap standing in the stall until the librarian knocked and said they were closing. She had put on the clean shirt from the plastic bag at the underpass. She had rubbed her shoes against her jeans until the worst of the mud came off. She looked like what she was, a young woman who had made an effort under difficult circumstances. She could not look like anything else because she did not have access to anything else, and she had decided that trying to perform wealth she did not have would make her seem worse than being honest about the wealth she lacked. Meridian Street was 6 blocks from the library in a part of downtown where the buildings were old and mostly offices, insurance agencies, a real estate broker, an accounting firm with a sign that needed repainting. Number 44 was a narrow brown stone with a brass plate by the door, tarnished but legible. Blackwell and Associates, established in 1952. The lights inside were on. She stood outside for 4 minutes. She was not afraid. She had stopped being afraid of specific things the year after her grandmother died, because after that year she had discovered that the worst that could happen was usually just another version of what had already happened, and she had survived that. What she felt standing outside Blackwell and Associates was not fear, it was the particular weight of a moment she could feel was hinging. A door that felt heavier right before you push it open. Not because the door has changed, but because you know something will be different once you cross through it. She pushed the door open. The reception area was small and smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting on a warmer for too long. A woman about 50 sat behind a desk with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a phone tucked it between her ear and shoulder. She held up one finger without looking at Sable and finished her call. Made a note on a yellow pad, looked up. She was the kind of woman who could assess a situation without her face showing the assessment. Sable recognized the type. Her grandmother had been that type. "Can I help you?" Sable put the envelope on the desk. "I need to speak with whoever currently administers the Edmund Crane Trust." The woman's face did not change, but something moved behind her eyes. The kind of movement that happens when a word you have not heard spoken aloud in a very long time is suddenly spoken by a stranger standing in front of your desk at 9:15 on a Thursday morning. She looked at the envelope, then at Sable. "Can I ask where you got this?" "A tree," Sable said. And then because that sounded wrong, without context, she added, it was nailed to a dead tree on the eastern boundary of the Ridgemont Road property, and I found it 11 days ago. The woman picked up the envelope. Careful by the edges, she held it the way someone holds something they recognize, something they have been told about but have never seen. She stood up. Please wait here. She went through a door in the back, and Sable heard muffled voices, then silence. Then more voices, quieter this time, the particular cadence of people processing information they did not expect to receive today. Sable sat in the reception chair and looked at the frame print on the wall. A covered bridge in autumn. The kind of print that had been on that wall for 30 years and would be there for 30 more. She breathed in and out and made herself stay still, because stillness was what you had when everything else was uncertain. The door opened. The man who came through was maybe 65, thin in a gray suit that fit him the way suits fit people who have worn them their whole lives. Not like a costume, like a second skin. He had reading glasses in his breast pocket and a quality of composure that meant he had received surprising information and was deciding how to hold it. He held out his hand. My name is Emmett Grail. I am a senior associate here. I have been with Blackwell and Associates for 32 years. Aldous Pemberton died in 2003. I administered his practice afterward, and I have been the trustee for the Crane instrument since then. He paused. Please come into my office. The office had bookshelves on 3 walls and a window that looked out onto the back of another building. He sat behind the desk and she sat across from it, and he opened a drawer and pulled out a file folder so thick it had 2 rubber bands around it, and he set it on the desk with the care of something that had been waiting. He opened it. The first page was a photocopy of the deed she was holding, or rather the deed she had returned to him because he had taken it when she laid it on his desk and she had not asked for it back, which was either trust or fatalism or both. He looked at his copy, then at the original she had brought. He said nothing for a long time. The clock on the wall behind him ticked into the silence and gave it a rhythm. Then he looked up. Miss Ashford, he began, but she corrected him before he could continue. My last name is Ashford. My grandmother was Ruth Ashford, born Ruth Crane. I do not use the Crane name. I did not know I had it until I read that letter. Grail nodded slowly. You will need to establish the lineage. It is a condition of the trust. Edmund's instructions were specific. The bearer must demonstrate Crane blood through documentary evidence. He paused. I have to tell you something honestly. She waited. In 32 years, 3 people have come into this office claiming to have found the envelope. He looked at the desk. The first was in 2001, the second was in 2014, the third was 2019. In all 3 cases, the envelope they presented was a copy or a forgery, or in one case an envelope that had been manufactured to look plausible by someone with enough knowledge of the trust to attempt it, but not enough access to the original materials to succeed. He looked up. The wax seal on the one you have brought is the original Crane seal. I know this because I have a photograph of it in this file taken in 1986 when Pemberton prepared the instrument. The cracking pattern in the wax matches. He sat back. This is, to the best of my knowledge, the first time the original document has been presented at this office. The sentence landed in the room and sat there. 37 years, 3 forgeries. And now the real thing, carried in by a woman with mud on her shoes and 11 days of a drainage ditch behind her. Sable looked at the file folder. She said what she had come to say. What happens now? What happens now, Grail said, is that I need to verify your lineage, which will take time and require documentation. If you have a birth certificate, your grandmother's death certificate, any marriage records that trace back to the Crane family. I have a birth certificate, she said. I do not carry most of those things. My grandmother's papers are in a storage unit in Bridger Falls. I stopped paying for it 4 months ago. I do not know if they have cleared it. Grail made a note. Then he set down his pen and looked at her with an expression she had not seen yet, the expression of someone about to deliver information they have been carrying alone for a long time. I also need to tell you something else, he said. Something that changes the urgency of this situation considerably. She waited. When I took over the trust administration from Aldo's in 2003, I inherited the full instrument file. All 700 pages of it. I have read it many times. But last year I began a comprehensive re-review in preparation for a periodic court filing, and I found a clause I had not previously given sufficient weight to. He opened the folder to a tabbed section. Edmund included a temporal condition in the trust. If the original deed is presented at this office but the bearer fails to completely niche verification within 90 days of the date of presentation, the claim is voided permanently. The property and all accumulated trust assets transferred to the Harmon County Public Lands Fund. He looked at her. Today is day one. Sable sat with that number, 90 days. She had walked into this office thinking the only obstacles were documentation and possibly a family she had never met. She had prepared herself for slow. She had prepared herself for difficult. She had not prepared herself for a clock. 90 days, 3 months. She did the math automatically, breaking the large number into smaller numbers she could hold and turn over. 3 months to prove that she was the great-grandniece of a man who had died 37 years ago in a county she had only been living in for 11 days. 3 months while a family she had never met assembled lawyers and arguments and whatever machinery wealthy people assembled when they wanted to prevent something from happening. She had once tried to get a copy of her own birth certificate replaced after losing it. That alone had taken 6 weeks. And that was just proving she was herself. She said the only thing that was relevant. Then we need to move fast. What do I need and where do I get it? Grail almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who had spent 32 years waiting for someone to walk through his door with the right envelope and the right response, and who was now watching it happen. He said the trust has been generating revenue since 1991 when the Mineralis arrangement came into effect. The account has not been touched. He opened to another tab in the folder, turned it to face her. She looked at the number. She looked at it for a long time. Written out a number is language, and language can be misread, can be dismissed, can be a mistake in transcription. But a number on an accounting statement with columns and dates and a running balance that had been updated as recently as 60 days ago was a different kind of real, 412,700,000 and some change. She did not cry. She asked for a glass of water. He got it himself. While he was gone, she thought about the drainage ditch. She thought about the way the water ran through it when it rained. How she had learned to move her cardboard uphill to avoid the seepage. She thought about the church shelter in Bridger Falls and the 3 families from the flooded trailer park who had taken the last beds, and she thought about them without resentment because they had needed those beds and she had found a way to an underpass and then to a dead tree. He came back with water and a box of tissues which he set on the desk without comment, which was kind. She drank the water. He sat. The process, he said, will take time. And given the 90-day clause, not much of it, you will need legal representation of your own. He held up a hand. Not because I am advising you not to trust this office. Aldous Pemberton was a man of integrity, and I have tried to be the same. But you are about to be the subject of significant attention, and you need someone specifically representing your interests. She said, how long will the documentation take? If we can locate your grandmother's records, he said, and if the genealogical verification can be expedited, we could file a formal claim within 10 to 12 days. That gives us nearly 80 days for challenges to be heard and resolved before the clock expires. He paused. There are living Crane descendants who have been aware of the trust's existence for some years. There have been challenges to the instrument in court. All of them have failed because no original deed was ever presented. But they will likely mount a challenge again when they become aware that you exist. She said, who? A man named James Crane Davenport, 71 years old. He has been the primary challenger, filed 3 motions against the trust instrument over 22 years, all denied. But he has resources and he has history with this office. She said, what kind of person is he? Grail considered his words carefully before he spoke them. He is a man who was told from a young age that he had an inheritance coming, and who has spent his adult life operating on that assumption. He is not a bad man. He is a person who believes a thing is his and has built himself around that belief. When that belief is corrected, the correction feels like theft. Even when the thing was never his, Sable heard that and stored it carefully, completely, without judgment yet. Judgment could come later. Right now, she needed information. She said, what about my grandmother's papers? Grail picked up the phone. He called the storage facility in Bridger Falls on speakers so she could hear. The woman who answered pulled up Unit 114, registered to Ruth Ashford. The unit has been flagged for clearance at 4 months of non-payment, the woman said. The clearance has not yet taken place because the facility is backlogged. The earliest a crew could clear it would be next week. Sable felt something loosen in her chest. 1 week. She had 1 week before Ruth's remaining papers became dumpster contents at a storage facility in a town 2 hours away. Grail authorized the back payment immediately through the trust's administrative account. 4 months at $60, $240, a phone call and a credit card number, and the thing she had been dreading for 4 months was resolved in the time it took the woman on the other end to type in the digits. This was how money worked when you had it, or when you had someone acting on your behalf who did. A phone call, 20 minutes. What she had been losing sleep over for 120 days, gone, handled. The specific cruelty of poverty was not the absence of things. It was the proximity of solutions you could not reach. The storage unit had been $60 a month, $60, and for 4 months she had watched the deadline approach, visible and inevitable and completely beyond her ability to change. Now it was paid. She said, I need to go to Bridger Falls tomorrow. Grail's assistant, a young man named Rowan, who wore sweaters that were slightly too large for him and spoke quietly, arranged $40 in petty cash from the trust's administrative account for the bus ticket and incidentals. She paid for the ticket with the 40. She kept the $4.37 separate. She did not spend it. It felt important that she not spend it yet, though she could not have said why. Only that the money represented something she was not ready to convert into something else. The bus to Bridger Falls left at 7:15 in the morning and took 2 hours and 40 minutes. It smelled like vinyl and diesel and a perfume. Someone in the back was wearing something with artificial vanilla. Sable sat by the window and watched the landscape shift from town to highway to the stretched out flatness of the county before the hills came back up on the other side. She had not been on a bus in a year that was going somewhere she chose to go. Every bus she had taken in the previous 18 months had been going away from something, away from Wade and the apartment where kindness had stopped all at once like a switch, away from the plant in Kolberg, away from Phyllis and the house with the 6 women and the rent that went up without warning. Buses going away, buses going toward places she did not fully want to be chosen because they were affordable and available and led somewhere that had not yet failed her. This bus was going toward something. She watched the window and let herself feel the difference. The storage facility in Bridger Falls was off the highway, a long row of orange storage units behind a chain link fence. The kind of place that smelled like dust and forgotten things and the specific sadness of objects that outlived the people who cared about them. She paid the arrears at the office window, received the access code, Walk down the road to Unit 114. The padlock was the one she had bought with her grandmother's spare key 3 years ago. It opened on the first try. Inside, Ruth Ashford's remaining life took up approximately 4 square feet of cubic space. A plastic bin with her kitchen things, plates, and cups wrapped in newspaper. 2 boxes of books, a garment bag with her good coat and her church dress, a flat cardboard box that Sable knew contained photographs, and at the back a fireproof metal box, small gray, the kind you bought at a hardware store to hold important papers. With a combination she had memorized at 16 because Ruth had made her memorize it along with the combination to the old safe at their apartment, treating both with the same seriousness. Left 22, right 8, left 31. She knelt on the concrete floor and opened it. Inside were the documents of a life. Ruth Ashford's birth certificate, her marriage certificate to Gordon Ashford, deceased, Gordon's death certificate, Sable's mother's birth certificate listed as Celia Ashford, which was a name Sable held for a moment because she had not thought of her mother's full name in a long time. Because her mother had left when Sable was 4 and the leaving had been total. No forwarding address, no birthday calls, no particular explanation offered to a grandmother raising a 4-year-old on a fixed income who had not asked for any of it but had done it anyway without complaint. Beneath Celia's birth certificate was Ruth's own mother's birth certificate, and beneath that a piece of paper that was older than everything else in the box, fragile at the folds, typed on a machine whose keys had been slightly uneven so that some letters pressed harder than others. It was a family record, the kind churches used to keep, the kind of document that traced their lineage through baptisms and marriages and deaths across several generations. And there at the top, unmistakable, was the name that Grail needed, Ruth Helen Crane. Born 1931, daughter of Raymond Crane and Marie DuPont Crane. Raymond Crane, born 1901, son of Arthur Crane, brother of Edmund Aldrich Crane. Sable sat on the floor of the storage unit in Bridger Falls with the document in her hands and the cold concrete under her knees and understood that her grandmother had known. Not the details, maybe. Not the trust. Not the envelope, not the $410 million, but the name, the blood, the stubborn, proud thing that did not ask for what it needed. Ruth had known who they were and had said so exactly once, over soup that was mostly broth, to a 9-year-old who could not understand it. She had not said more because more was not hers to claim, or because she had not known more, or because the Crane way of being was to state a thing once and let it sit and let the person who needed it find it when they were ready. Sable photographed every document with the disposable camera she had bought at the drugstore 2 blocks from the motel. She photographed the church record 3 times from different angles. She put everything back in the fireproof box, locked it, and carried it with her. She left the other things in the unit. She would deal with them later. Right now she had what she needed, and the clock was running. On the bus back to Harmon County, she held the box in her lap. Outside the window, the landscape unreeled itself in the flat, disinterested way of highway travel. And she thought about Edmund Aldrich Crane, born 1899, who had lived 88 years without children, who had watched his family fracture along lines of money and resentment, who had written a trust instrument so specific and so eccentric that it had held for over 30 years against 3 separate attempts to break it, and who had trusted against all evidence that the world was inclined toward that kind of faith, that the right person would eventually come. She did not believe in the supernatural. She believed in something adjacent to it. The persistence of intent, the way a decision made by a person could survive them, could ripple forward through time, could find its target years or decades after the person who made it was gone. Her grandmother had made that kind of decision, to say the name once to a child. over soup and trust that it would be enough. Edmund had made that kind of decision, to seal a letter in wax, to nail it to a dying tree, to wait. They had both sent things forward into the future, and the future had received them. She got back to Harmon County at 4:30 in the afternoon. She went directly to Grail's office. Rowan was still there, sweater and all, and he led her into Grail's office without making her wait. She spread the photographs on his desk. He studied them. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up, and for the first time since she had walked into his office, something that was not professional neutrality crossed his face. It was something older and quieter than surprise. It was the face of a man who has waited a long time for a thing he was not sure would ever happen. The Raymond Crane connection, he said, puts you in the direct collateral line. Great-grandniece of Edmund. It is well within the trust's definition of Crane issue. He looked at the church record. This document alone is likely sufficient if we can get a notarized copy made and an independent genealogical verification. She said, "What do we do now?" He said, "I make some calls. There is a family law attorney in the city I trust. Her name is Cordelia Hale. She is the best person I know for something like this. I will call her tonight. Tomorrow you will meet with her." She said, "What does it cost?" He said, "The trust pays for it. It is in the instrument." Edmund was thorough. She looked at the photograph spread across his desk, at Ruth's name, at Edmund's name, at the chain of baptisms and marriages going back 100 years, the paper trail of a family that had dispersed and forgotten and remembered in fragments. And she was the fragment that had found its way back. She said, "How long before the family finds out?" Grayla was quiet for a moment. "I have a legal obligation to notify the known parties when a claim is filed. Once I file the claim, which I will do when the documentation is ready, they will have 30 days to respond." He paused. "I would expect them to respond considerably faster than that. And every day of response is a day off the 90. She understood. The clock was not just counting down to a deadline. It was counting down through a gauntlet. 90 days to prove who she was, while people she had never met tried to prove she was not. She said, "I understand." He said, "There is one more thing. The trust has provisions for the identified bearer pending verification. A living stipend." He found the page and read it aloud. "The identified bearer pending verification shall be entitled to reasonable living expenses from the trust at the discretion of the administering trustee." He looked up. "I would consider $2,000 a month reasonable." $2,000 a month. For 11 days, she had been measuring life in terms of whether she could afford a $4 can of soup without breaking into her emergency fund. $2,000 a month felt like a number from someone else's life that had wandered into hers by accident. She said, "Yes, I will take it." He nodded. "You will need an address for disbursement. Do you have somewhere to stay?" "No." He made another note. "There is a motel on Clement Street, the Hafford. It is clean and they rent by the week." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. "Tell them Emmett Grail sent you and that the billing will be handled through this office until the stipend arrangement is formalized." She looked at the paper. She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because Aldous Pemberton spent 32 years hoping this day would come. He believed Edmund was right, that the right person would find that envelope, and that when they did, they deserved what was inside it." He looked at the file. "And because you are sitting in my office with 11 days of a drainage ditch on you and a deed to a $400 million estate in your hand, and you have not cried or demanded anything or asked me to just hand it all over right now." He paused. "You made a list. I could see it in your eyes the moment you walked in. You were working through the problem before you had any reason to believe the problem had a solution." He closed the folder. "Aldous would have liked you." She picked up the piece of paper with the motel address. She stood, she put out her hand, and he shook it. The walk to the Halford Motel on Clement Street took 12 minutes. She counted them. 12 minutes between the life she had been living and the first concrete step towards something else. which was not yet real and would not be real for many weeks, but which was moving from the territory of impossible into the territory of merely difficult, and difficult she knew how to walk toward. The motel was clean, as he had said. The woman at the front desk, whose name tag said Barbara, made one phone call, talked for 3 minutes, and handed Sable a key to room 7 without asking any questions that a person in Sable's current state could not answer. This was either professionalism or the particular mercy of someone who had seen enough of life to know when questions would only make things worse. Room 7 had a bed with a blue coverlet, a small bathroom with a shower, a television she did not turn on, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot where a man was loading boxes into a truck with the steady, methodical movement of someone who had done this job for years and found it sufficient. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put the envelope on the nightstand. She looked at it. Then she lay down, still in her shoes, and stared at the ceiling, which was white and water-stained in one corner. And she thought about her grandmother, who had said the Crane blood was proud and stubborn and did not ask for things. And she thought, Ruth, I did not ask. I just looked at the right angle. She fell asleep before she meant to, the deep and boneless sleep of someone whose body has been waiting for a flat surface and permission to stop for 11 days. She woke at 4:47 in the morning. She lay still for 3 full minutes before she understood why she had woken up. It was not a noise. It was the absence of one. No traffic from an overhead road, no wind through concrete columns. Just the silence of a room with walls and a door that locked from the inside. She lay in that silence and let it hold her. She had not been held by anything in a long time, not by a person, not by a place. The last time she had felt something close to it was the morning Ruth had died. Sable had been 16. She had come home from school and found Ruth in the kitchen chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed, and the radiator clanking its 40-second rhythm into a room where no one was listening anymore. And Sable had stood in the doorway for a very long time, not because she did not understand, but because she understood completely and needed a moment to decide what to do with the understanding. That was 7 years ago. After that, the practical shoes had become impractical very quickly, because practical required floor to stand on, and floors cost money, and money required a job, and jobs required an address, and addresses required money, and around until the circle ate itself, and she was 23 years old looking at an envelope that might be her way out of the circle, or might be another version of the circle wearing different clothes. She got up, turned the shower on as hot as it would go, and stood under it until the water started to cool. She had not stood under hot water for more than 2 minutes in 11 days. At the library, she had used the sink. At the shelter before that, the showers were timed. 3 minutes, a buzzard, the water cutting off mid-rinse. Here the water ran until she decided it was done. That was not a small thing. That was the luxury of agency, of being the person who decided when something stopped. She stood at the bathroom mirror after, which she had not looked into in a focused way for some time, because mirrors in public bathrooms had a specific cruelty to them, the fluorescent light that turned you into a stranger. This mirror was smaller and kinder, lit by a single lamp from the bedroom, and she looked at herself without flinching. 23 years old. The face looking back at her was not the face of someone who had gotten everything wrong. It was the face of someone who had been handed a very difficult equation and had kept working it. She took the envelope from the nightstand and unfolded the letter again on the bed. 4 pages in Aldous Pemberton's careful penmanship recording Edmund Aldrich Crane's exact words. She read those words again in the motel lamplight and thought about what it meant that a man born in 1899 had written them in 1986, and they had waited 37 years on a dead tree for a woman who had been paying attention, not because she was wise or gifted or special, but because she had nothing else to do but pay attention. Because when you have nothing, attention is free. It is the one resource that poverty cannot take from you, the ability to look, to notice, to see what is there when everyone else is too busy or too comfortable or too certain of what they already know to bother looking. Edmund had known that. He had counted on it. She folded the letter back into the envelope. She picked up her notebook, the one she kept in her jacket for lists and thinking. She wrote down everything she knew, not the money, not the estate, the chain of events and the chain of problems and the 90-day clock that was now on day 6. She numbered the items. She put a circle next to the ones she could address in the next 24 hours. Storage unit, bus ticket, church record, notarization, genealogical verification, Cordelia Hale, each one a step, each step a day off the clock. Then she wrote at the top of a fresh page in letters that were small and steady and certain, Day 1. She thought about Ruth, she thought about Edmund, she thought about the particular chain of stubbornness and silence and faith that connected them across generations they had never shared. Ruth saying the name once over soup, Edmund nailing an envelope to a tree, both of them trusting that the future would do its part. She was the future, she was the part that had been trusted to arrive. And then she got to work. 84 days remained for the worthy part 2, the trial. Cordelia Hale's office was on the 3rd floor of a building that had once been a textile mill and still smelled faintly of machine oil and old wood in the way buildings carry their histories in the walls long after the industry is gone. The elevator was slow. The hallway was narrow. The frosted glass on her door said Hale Law in plain block letters with nothing else underneath, which Sable later understood was intentional. Cordelia Hale did not need to advertise. She was 51, compact and precise in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago which things were worth energy and which were not. She wore her hair short and practical. She had reading glasses on a beaded chain and a desk so clean it looked like she had just moved in. Except the bookshelves behind her were so densely packed they seemed structural, like they were holding the wall up. She stood when Sable came in, shook her hand, said sit down, poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, sat across from her and said, Emmett Grail called me last night and told me everything he knows, which means I have the outline. I would like to hear it from you, so Sable told her. She told her from the beginning, from the drainage ditch to the dead tree to the envelope to the underpass and the candle and the list. She told her about the bus to Bridger Falls and the storage unit and the fireproof box and Ruth's name on the church record next to Raymond Crane. She told it in order without editorializing, start at the start and stop at the stop and let the facts carry the weight. Cordelia listened. Without interrupting, she made notes on a legal pad with a pen that she held the way surgeons hold instruments, with intention, with the awareness that what she was writing down might matter later in ways neither of them could predict yet. When Sable finished, Cordelia looked at her notes for a moment and then looked up. You said you made a list the first night. What was on it? Sable told her. The 4 questions. Was it real? Why had no one found it? Would they take her seriously? What happened if she was wrong? Cordelia's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted. The kind of shift that means you have confirmed something you were already thinking. Okay, she said, here is what you need to understand about the situation you are in. She turned the legal pad around and drew a line down the middle. On the left side, she wrote what the trust says. On the right side, she wrote what the family will argue. What the trust says is clear, she said. Bearer of the original deed, demonstrable Crane lineage, presented to Blackwell and Associates. You satisfy all 3 conditions. The trust instrument is 37 years old. It has survived 3 prior legal challenges. The court has upheld its validity each time. She tapped the left side of the page. This is your ground. It is solid. She tapped the right side. What the family will argue is that you found the deed through means that undermine the spirit of the instrument. They will say the tree was on private property and you were trespassing. They will say the deed had been deliberately hidden and not publicly accessible. They will say the lineage documentation has gaps and that your grandmother's departure from the Crane name constitutes a severing of the bloodline in terms of the trust's intent. She paused. None of these arguments have legal merit, I want to say that clearly, but they do not need legal merit in the first instance. They need enough substance to get a judge to grant a temporary injunction on the transfer while the challenges are heard. And if they get an injunction, the process slows down, and you do not have time for slow. You have 83 days. Sable said, "How do we prevent the injunction?" Cordelia said, "We file first, before they know you exist. We begin the formal lineage verification through independent genealogical analysis. We get the church record notarized and authenticated. We file a notice of claim with the trust and simultaneously with the county property office. We get ahead of them on every document so that by the time their lawyer is making phone calls, we have already answered the questions the judge will ask. How long does that take? If I work this weekend, which I will, and if the genealogical service I use can turn the authentication around in 5 days, which they can we file by next Monday." Day 12, Sable did the math. Day 12 of 90, that left 78 days for everything else. She said, "How much do the genealogical services cost?" Cordelia said, "It comes out of the trust's legal provision, same as my fees." Edmund was thorough. That was the second time someone had said that about Edmund Crane. Sable was beginning to build a picture of him from the things people said about him. A man who was thorough. A man who watched his family fracture and decided to do something eccentric and specific about it. A man who had lived to 88 and left an envelope on a tree and trusted a stranger he would never meet. She said, "Tell me about James Crane Davenport." Cordelia set down her pen. She said, "I have encountered him through the prior challenges. He retained counsel for all three. A firm out of the state capital, expensive and capable. He has significant resources. His father was one of Edmund's nephews, a man named George Davenport, who married into the Crane name and hyphenated. James grew up being told the estate was the family's rightful inheritance, and that the trust instrument was a product of Edmund's eccentricity and declining mental capacity." Sable said, "Was Edmund's capacity declining?" "No." Cordelia said it flatly. Aldous Pemberton documented his client's mental acuity extensively during the drafting of the trust. There are 17 pages of notes from their sessions. Edmund was precise, specific, fully oriented. He knew exactly what he was doing. The mental capacity argument was the first thing James's lawyers tried in 2001, and the court dismissed it in 3 weeks. Sable thought about the letter, the careful penmanship, the specific logic of the conditions, the line about the right person for any task not always being the loudest or the most connected. That was not the writing of someone whose mind was failing. That was the writing of someone who had thought very hard about something for a long time and had arrived at a conclusion he was not going to be talked out of. She said, "When James finds out about me, what is his first move?" Cordelia considered. "His first move will be to discredit you, not the document, because the document is bulletproof. He will look for anything in your background that suggests instability or bad faith. He will look at the time you have been on the street. He will look for a criminal record." She paused. "Do you have one?" "No." "Any involvement with law enforcement that did not result in charges?" Sable thought. Once, 2 years ago, she had been questioned by a police officer who found her sleeping in a park in a city 3 hours from here. She had been released without action because sleeping in a park was not a crime in that jurisdiction, and she had been polite and cooperative and had a clean record. The officer had taken her name, she told Cordelia. Cordelia made a note. "That will not be an issue." She paused. "He will also try to find people who will testify that you are an opportunist. that you somehow manufactured or obtained the document rather than finding it. Sable said, "Can you prove that I did not know about the trust before I found it?" Cordelia looked at her steadily. "That is the right question. And the answer is that we prove it by building a timeline so complete and so documented that the alternative explanation becomes impossible. Your shelter records, your employment records, your movements for the past 2 years. None of them connect to Harmon County or the Crane family or anything adjacent. You were not here because of the trust. You were here because every other place had failed and this was the next place on the map." She said, "I need you to do something for the next 7 days until we file. Stay at the Hartford. Do not talk about this to anyone. Do not look at anything related to this on the library computers using a guest login because those logs are so painable. Do not contact any member of the Crane family or anyone adjacent to them." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good." She picked up her pen again. "There is one more thing. The estate is currently being managed by a property services company contracted through the trust. Emmett has already notified them that a claim has been filed and that access should be granted to the claimant for a preliminary viewing." She looked at Sable. "You can go see it this week if you want. I would recommend it. Whatever that property means to you on paper will change once you have walked it." Sable said, "I want to go tomorrow." Cordelia said, "I will arrange it." She did. The property services man who met her at the gate on Ridgemont Road the following morning was named Lester. He was the kind of man who communicated primarily through function, showing her where to step, which gate to use, pointing out the soft ground near the pond without explaining why it was soft. He had a clipboard and a set of keys and a truck with the company logo on the door, and he was clearly accustomed to visiting a property where no one lived, going through the motions of maintenance and leaving. The gate was set back from the road by a gravel drive that had been overtaken at the edges by grass. Beyond the gate, the drive continued up a gentle rise before turning south toward the main house. The property was not flat, it rolled in the way that hill country rolls, with intention, the land deciding where it wanted to be and the human structures arranged in conversation with that decision rather than against it. She stood at the top of the rise for a moment. The main house was a large stone and timber structure, 2 stories with a wide covered porch along the front and a chimney at each end. The stone was local gray limestone quarried and laid by someone who understood that the point of stone was permanence. The timber was dark, weathered, the color of wood that has been outside long enough to become part of the landscape. She did not go inside, not yet. She stood at the top of the rise and she looked east, along the fence line, the rusted wire, and just at the edge of her vision, the shape of the dead tree rising above the fence, gray and bare and still standing. She was on the inside now. Lester led her into the house, up the stairs, past bedrooms with windows looking out onto different aspects of the property, to a room at the end of the upper hall where built-in shelves still held books, real books, left behind because whoever cleared the house after Edmund's death had not thought them worth taking or had known they belonged to the place. She looked at the spines: history, agriculture, natural science, a complete set of encyclopedias from the 1950s, a shelf of novels with cracked spines, and one book separate from the others, laid flat on the shelf rather than standing. A slim volume with a plain cloth cover. She picked it up. It was a journal. Inside the front cover, in the same careful hand as the letter on the dead tree, R. Crane, private record 1982. She held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, the other kind. The weight of a man's private thoughts written down in a year when he was 83 years old and thinking about what would happen after he was gone. She took it with her. She would read it somewhere private, somewhere she could take the time it deserved. She read it that night in room 7 of the Hartford Motel. She read it for 3 hours. Edmund had written in it every few days from January through October, 10 months of an 83-year-old man's life. But those 10 months were full. He wrote about the property in the specific way of someone who knows every square foot of a piece of land and has opinions about each. He wrote about the timber stand and the pond levels and the way the kitchen garden performed in a dry summer. He wrote about the family obliquely with a restraint that read more clearly than anger would have. She found the first entry she had not known she was looking for on page 47. September 8th. George came today. Second time this month. Convenient to nothing except his continuing curiosity about what the old man intends to do with his land and his money. He brought a bottle of wine I did not ask for and a question I did not answer. He told his boy the estate would go to them. I said no such thing. George hears what George wants to hear. That has always been his way. She read it twice. She thought about James Crane Davenport growing up with his father's version of a conversation that had never happened the way his father described it. She thought about what it did to a person to build a life on a story that someone else had told them was true. She turned to October. October 17th. Walk the eastern boundary this afternoon. The dead elm at the fence line is going gray. It will be gone in a few years, I expect. I have been thinking about it. Not as a landmark, but as something more. A marker. Aldous thinks I am being sentimental. Aldous is probably right. But there is something to the idea of leaving a message in a place that most people will not think to look. Not hidden, just overlooked. The right person will look. The right person always looks at the things other people pass. She stopped breathing for a moment. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that happens when you read something and understand that the person who wrote it was describing you before you existed. Before your mother was born, before your grandmother married and changed her name and moved away from the Crane line and never looked back. Edmund had watched that tree go gray in 1982, 4 years before he wrote the trust, 5 years before he died. He had stood at the eastern boundary of his property and looked at the dying elm and thought, that is where I will leave it. And he had waited. And when the time was right, he had nailed an envelope to that tree and trusted that the world would do the rest. She turned to one more entry, March 3rd. The question I keep returning to is not what the land is worth, but what it is for. Worth and for are different questions, and most people stop at worth, which is the lesser question. Worth tells you what someone will pay, for tells you what something means. I have spent 40 years learning what this land is for. It is for the patient. It is for the attentive. It is for the person who will stand at the edge of the pond at a specific hour and watch the light and understand without being told that this is what land is. She read that passage twice. She thought about the drainage ditch and the acute awareness of concrete and cold water and the sound of traffic overhead. She thought, we are not so different, Edmund. She thought it, and it surprised her, and then it did not. She closed the journal. She held it against her chest. She said out loud to no one in the motel room, I found your tree. The room did not answer, but it felt different after that, the way a room feels when you have said something that needed saying. She spent part of each week at the estate. During the days that followed, she had a key. Lester had given her one on Grail's authorization. She walked the property to accumulate detail, to build the kind of knowledge that only comes from repeated presence. She learned where the ground was soft near the pond's eastern edge and where it was firm. She learned which of the barn's roof joints flexed in wind and which were solid. She learned that the kitchen garden soil was extraordinary, dark and deep, worked for decades, and underneath the overgrowth there was a structure, a composting system, a drainage channel. Beds laid out with care by someone who had thought extensively about kitchen garden design before committing to the layout. Edmund. She found his name in the most unexpected places. In the pegboard in the workshop where every tool had its specific outline, painted in white so it could be returned to exactly the right position. In the shelving in the kitchen where the spacing between shelves was calibrated to the height of his specific preserving jars. In the way, the stone path from the house to the pond curved slightly south to avoid a particular root system. He had designed the path around the tree rather than trimming the tree to accommodate the path. A man who worked with what was there rather than imposing on it. Cordelia filed the claim on day 12, exactly as she had promised. By day 14, the genealogical authentication was complete. A 30-page report tracing the Crane family line from Edmund's grandfather forward through all the branches, mapping every marriage, every naming shift, every departure from the surname, including the specific chain that ran through Raymond Crane, to Ruth Ashford, to Celia Ashford, to Sable Ashford. The report was thorough. Edmund would have approved. On day 16, the phone call came that Cordelia had been expecting and Sable had been preparing for. Cordelia called her at the motel. Her voice was the same as always, level and precise. But there was something underneath it, the particular tension of a professional who has been waiting for the other side to move and has just felt the ground shift. James Crane Davenport knows about you, she said, but not from the filing. He found out through a leak. Someone at the property services company mentioned the site visit to someone who mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to James's people. He has known for 2 days. His lawyers have been working around the clock. Sable sat on the edge of the bed. She said, "What did they file?" Cordelia said they did not file a challenge to the claim. Not yet. They filed something worse. They filed a motion to suspend the 90-day clock pending a full judicial review of the trust instrument's temporal clause. If the judge grants the suspension, the clock stops, which sounds good for you, but it is not. Because what it actually does is remove the deadline that is currently forcing the court to act quickly. Without the deadline, the case goes into standard scheduling. Standard scheduling in this county means 12 to 18 months. And during those months, the trust assets remain frozen and you remain in the Hufford Motel on a $2,000 stipend, while James's lawyers run every procedural delay in the book. She paused. It is a smart move. It looks generous. It looks like they are giving you more time. But what they are actually doing is taking away the one structural advantage you have, which is urgency. Sable thought about this methodically, turning it over, looking at it from the angle that most people would not look at. She said, "What if the judge denies it?" "If the judge denies it," Cordelia said, "then the clock keeps running and we are back to where we were. 74 days minus whatever the hearing takes. But if the judge denies the suspension, James's lawyers will almost certainly file an immediate motion for preliminary injunction on the transfer itself. Either way, we end up in front of a judge arguing about time. When is the hearing? Friday, 4 days from now, day 20. Sable said, "I will be there." Cordelia said, "I know you will." The courthouse was a solid limestone building on the center of Harmon County's downtown square. 4 stories with broad steps and the kind of institutional gravity that courthouses cultivate deliberately because the gravity is part of the function. It tells you before you walk through the door that what happens inside carries weight. Sable climbed the steps with Cordelia beside her and Emmett Grayle behind. She felt none of the things she might have expected to feel. Not fear, not awe. She felt clear. The courtroom was not large. Judge Sylvia Kessler was 60 with gray hair and reading glasses and the expression of someone who had heard every possible version of people's claims on each other and had developed through long exposure a particular patience for the gap between what people said and what they meant. James Crane Davenport was already seated at the opposing table. She had not seen a photograph of him. She had read his deposition from the 2019 challenge and Cordelia's notes and the prior case files, and she had built a version of him in her mind that was not quite what sat across the room. He was large, broad through the shoulders, with white hair and a face that bore the specific lines of a person who had been outdoors in all weather for many decades. He wore a dark suit that sat on him like a uniform. He was not looking at her. His lawyers were two, a man and a woman from the capital firm, polished and organized in the way of people who charged by the increment and were very good at what they charged for. The man's name was Aldrich. He spoke first. He was good, she would give him that. He laid out the motion for clock suspension clearly and without waste. His argument was reasonable on its surface. The 90-day clause created undue pressure on the court to adjudicate a complex property matter within an arbitrary time frame. The trust's temporal condition should be evaluated independently before it was allowed to dictate the pace of the entire proceeding. Justice required deliberation. Deliberation required time. She watched him while he spoke. She watched the judge. Judge Kessler listened with her hands flat on the bench, making no notes, which Sable would later learn meant the judge had already read everything and was listening for what the words did not say. Cordelia responded she did not try to outperform Aldrich. She cut to the structural center of the legal question and answered it there, without decoration, without theatrics, in a way that left no room for counter-argument because the counter-argument had already been anticipated and closed off. Cordelia said the temporal clause is not an accident. It is not a defect. It is the testator's explicit instruction. Edmund Crane included it because he understood that delay was the primary weapon available to those who would challenge the instrument. He anticipated this exact motion. He designed the trust to prevent it. She looked at the judge. Suspending the clock does not create fairness. It removes the structural protection Edmund built into his own instrument to ensure that the transfer could not be stalled indefinitely by parties with superior resources. The claimant is a 23-year-old woman living in a motel on a $2,000 monthly stipend. The challenging party has retained a capital firm billing at rates that exceed the claimant's entire monthly income. Without the clock, the resource asymmetry alone will determine the outcome. Edmund knew that. That is why he built the clock. Judge Kessler looked at both tables. She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. She said, I am going to deny the motion for clock suspension. The temporal clause is a component of the trust instrument. The trust instrument has been upheld 3 times by this court. I am not going to dismantle it one clause at a time to accommodate the challenging party's preference for a longer timeline. She looked at Aldrich. The clock continues to run. If you intend to challenge the claim on its merits, I suggest you do so promptly. I am scheduling a full verification hearing for 50 days from today, day 70 of the 90-day period. That gives both parties adequate preparation time while respecting the instrument's conditions. She paused, and I will say this once. If the challenging party files motions designed primarily to consume the remaining days on the clock rather than to advance a substantive legal argument, I will treat those motions accordingly. This court's time is not a resource to be spent on strategy. She adjourned. Cordelia put her hand briefly on Sable's arm, one touch, brief and specific, her way of marking a moment without making it a performance. But Sable was not looking at Cordelia. She was looking across the room at James Crane Davenport. He was talking to his lawyers in a low voice, his back to the room. One of the lawyers was taking notes. The other was looking at his phone. James himself was not doing anything frantic or dramatic. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, listening, and when his lawyer finished speaking, he nodded once, slowly. The nod of a person processing information rather than reacting to it. Then he turned, he looked at her. She looked back. It lasted only a few seconds. Then his lawyers moved and the moment closed and he was out the side door before she had fully registered what she had seen in his face. Which was not anger, not contempt, it was recognition. The specific look of someone seeing a thing they have been waiting for and having it be different than they imagined. She stored it. She would need it later. The 50 days between the hearing and the trial pass with the particular quality of time that is both too slow and too fast. slowly at the day level and impossibly fast at the level of what needed doing. Cordelia prepared the lineage documentation for formal court submission. The genealogical firm produced its 30-page report. Every marriage, every naming shift, every departure from the surname, all verified, all notarized, all ready. James's lawyers submitted 2 motions during the 50 days. Cordelia answered both within 48 hours. Neither motion reached the threshold for disrupting the scheduled hearing, but the second motion contained something that made Cordelia sit up straighter at her desk when she read it, and that made her call Sable immediately. They found a letter, Cordelia said, a letter Edmund wrote to George Davenport in 1985, 1 year before the trust was drafted. In the letter, Edmund wrote that the family would be taken care of. Sable was quiet. Cordelia said James's lawyers are going to argue that this letter constitutes evidence of Edmund's intent to leave the estate to the family, and that the trust instrument drafted 1 year later was a product of diminished capacity or undue influence by Pemberton. The letter is their new evidence, the thing Judge Kessler told them to bring if they wanted to mount a challenge. Sable thought about this. She thought about the journal entry from September 8th. George came today. He told his boy the estate would go to them. I said no such thing. She said I have something too. She told Cordelia about the journal, about the September entry where Edmund described George's visit, where Edmund wrote plainly that he had never promised the estate to anyone, that George heard what George wanted to hear. Cordelia was quiet for 3 seconds, which was a long silence for Cordelia. She said, "Bring me the journal tomorrow morning." Sable also told her something else, something she had been turning over since the night she read the journal for the first time. She had used the library computers during her 2 days of research before going to the law office. She had searched for Crane Estate and Harmon County Trust and property transfer law and other terms that anyone determined could trace back to the Crane Trust if they pulled the library's search logs. She told Cordelia the dates, day 3 and day 4, after she found the envelope, before she went to the law office. The searches were research. They were not evidence of prior knowledge, but they were searchable. And she wanted Cordelia to know before someone else found them. Cordelia was quiet again, longer this time. She said, "Thank you for telling me. Most people would not have thought to mention that, and most lawyers would not have known to ask until it was too late." She made a note. She said, "We will address it preemptively in your testimony. If Aldrich finds those logs and tries to use them, we will have already explained the timeline. The searches happened after the discovery. The shelter records and the drainage ditch timeline prove you were not in Harmon County before day 1. The logs prove you did your homework, which is consistent with who you are, not with who they want you to be." The trial was scheduled for a Thursday in January, day 70 of 90. The morning arrived gray and cold. The sky the particular color of something about to happen that had not decided what yet. Sable wore the best clothes she had, which were not particularly good but were clean and pressed with the motel iron. Cordelia had offered to buy her something suitable. She had said no once. Clearly, Cordelia had said fine and had not offered again, which was correct. She climbed the courthouse steps with a journal in her bag and the fireproof box with Ruth's documents and 70 days of preparation packed into the folders Cordelia carried beside her. The courtroom was the same limestone walls, same high windows letting in the flat January light. James Crane Davenport was already seated. Same dark suit, same stillness. His lawyers flanked him with their files open. The architecture of a challenge assembled and ready. Aldrich presented the family's case for 2 hours. He built it around the 1985 letter. Edmund's own words, "The family will be taken care of." He read it aloud twice. He let it sit in the courtroom air like evidence that spoke for itself. Then he ran the secondary arguments. The unusual delivery mechanism suggested a testator who was not thinking clearly. The bearer deed clause was an anachronism inconsistent with modern property law. And the claimant's presence on Ridgemont Road was not random proximity but the calculated positioning of someone with prior knowledge. This last argument was where he spent the most time. He was at his best here, building through implication rather than assertion, asking questions that assumed things he could not prove and letting the assumptions breathe. Then it was Cordelia's turn. She did not try to outperform Aldrich. She dismantled his argument by removing the load-bearing pieces until the rest collapsed under its own weight. She held up the 1985 letter. She read the sentence aloud. The family will be taken care of. Then she said, taken care of is not the same as given the estate. Taken care of is not the same as named in a will. Taken care of is a phrase that means exactly what it says, that Edmund intended for the family to be taken care of. And he did take care of them. He built a trust instrument that ensured the property would go to the right person, a person who would care for the land the way it deserved. That was Edmund taking care of the family's legacy, not their bank accounts. She paused. Then she opened the journal to the September entry. She read it aloud. George came today. He told his boy the estate would go to them. I said no such thing. The courtroom was very quiet. She said, this is Edmund Aldrich Crane's private journal, written in his own hand in September of 1982, 4 years before the trust was drafted, 3 years before the letter the opposing counsel has presented as evidence of intent. In this entry, Edmund states clearly and without ambiguity that he never promised the estate to the family, that George Davenport fabricated the promise, that George heard what he wanted to hear. She looked at Aldrich. The 1985 letter says the family will be taken care of. Edmund's own journal says he never promised them the estate. These are not contradictory, they are consistent. Edmund cared about the family, he did not trust them with the land. Both things were true. The trust instrument reconciles them. She set the journal down. Then she called Sable. Sable stood. She told the story the same way she had told it to Cordelia on the first day. From the drainage ditch, from the 11 days, from the particular angle at which she had been standing when she noticed the corner of wax cloth showing beneath the bark. She told it without embellishment, without apology, without performed emotion that asks the listener to feel rather than understand. Aldrich cross-examined for 30 minutes. He was looking for inconsistency. He did not find any because there was none to find. She had told the same story to Cordelia, to Grail, to the suspension hearing, and now to this courtroom in the same order with the same details, because it was what had happened, and what had happened did not change based on who was asking. Then Aldrich found the angle he had been saving. He said, Miss Ashford, library computer records from the Harmon County Public Library show that on 2 dates in October, someone using a guest login at Terminal 4 searched for the following terms: Crane Estate, Harmon County, Perpetual Trust, Bearer Deed, Property Transfer, Harmon County Trust. He looked at her. Those searches were conducted before you presented the envelope at Blackwell and Associates. Can you explain them? The courtroom shifted. Cordelia's hand moved on the table. A small movement. The movement of a lawyer who had prepared for this moment but was watching it arrive with the particular alertness of someone who knows that preparation and execution are different things. Sable looked at Aldrich. She did not rush her answer. Yes, she said, I found the envelope on a Monday. I spent 2 days at the library before going to the law office on Thursday. I was sleeping in a drainage ditch. I did not have a phone. I did not have a lawyer. I had a document that said I might be worth $400 million, and I needed to understand whether it was real before I walked into an office and made a claim that might get me arrested or committed. She paused. I searched those terms because I was doing what any careful person would do. I was verifying that the mechanism described in the letter was legally possible. I was checking that the law office existed. I was educating myself so that when I walked through that door, I would know enough to ask the right questions. She paused again. Those searches happened on days 3 and 4, after I found the envelope, not before. My shelter records in Bridger Falls show I was in a different county until 10 days before the discovery. The church shelter's intake records, their departure records, and the testimony of the shelter director all confirm that I was not in Harmon County until I arrived on foot with one bag and $4.37. I did not search for the Crane Trust before I found the envelope because I did not know the Crane Trust existed. Aldrich said nothing for several seconds. He was recalculating. She could see it in the way his eyes moved. The particular rapid movement of a lawyer who has fired his best shot and is deciding whether to fire another or sit down. He said, "But you remember the Crane name. Your grandmother mentioned it." She said, "Yes. One time I was 9 years old," she said. "The Crane blood was proud." She did not say there was an estate. She did not say there was a trust. She did not say there was a property. I thought she was talking about character. Aldrich said, "But you remembered it." Sable looked at him steadily. "I remember most things. My grandmother told me she died when I was 16 and she was the person who raised me. I remember everything she said. That does not mean I understood it. Understanding came later. Understanding came when I read a letter by candlelight in an underpass and saw the name Crane and thought that is what she was talking about. That is what proud meant. Not a feeling, a family I did not know I belonged to." The courtroom was quiet for a long time. Aldrich had no follow-up. He sat down. Judge Kessler made a note. Then she looked at both tables. She said, "I am going to take a 30-minute recess and then I will deliver my ruling." She looked at Aldrich. "I want to say something before we break. I have now presided over a case involving this trust instrument for the first time, but I have read the transcripts of the 3 prior challenges thoroughly. I see a consistent pattern of well-funded legal challenge against the trust instrument that has been upheld 3 times on its merits." She paused. "I am not unsympathetic to your client's position. I want to be clear about that. But I am also not sympathetic to the use of legal process to delay what the court has repeatedly found to be a valid instrument simply because the specific bearer of the deed is not the bearer the family anticipated." She rose. Everyone rose. The 30 minutes passed. Cordelia organized her folders. Grail came from the gallery and spoke quietly about procedural matters. Sable listened and responded and kept the bulk of her attention on the room. James Crane Davenport sat at his table across the room. His lawyers were leaning in and speaking. He was not speaking back. He was sitting with his hands on the table, very still, looking at the middle distance. The stillness of a man who had run a very long race and was at the final stretch and already knew what the finish line was going to say. She looked at him and felt the thing she had been carrying since she read his deposition from the 2019 case. Not guilt, something more careful than guilt. The awareness that her gain and his loss were not separate events. They were the same event experienced from different positions. Judge Kessler returned. Everyone stood. She opened the folder in front of her. She said, "The genealogical authentication presented by the claimant is thorough and independently verified. The lineage from Edmund Aldrich Crane through his brother Raymond to the claimant is established to a reasonable legal standard. The original deed, authenticated by Emmett Grail, who has served as trustee since 2003, is the document specified in the instrument." She paused. "The challenges raised by the opposing party are not supported by the evidence presented in this hearing. The 1985 letter does not constitute a promise of inheritance. The journal entry presented by the claimant's counsel demonstrates that Edmund Crane himself distinguished between caring for the family and entrusting them with the property. The mental capacity argument fails on the same grounds it failed in 2001. The bearer validity argument fails on the same grounds it failed in 2019. And the argument regarding the claimant's prior knowledge is not supported by a single piece of evidence that rises above speculation. The library search records, far from indicating prior knowledge, demonstrate the due diligence of a careful person verifying information she had only just received. She removed her glasses. The transfer of Crane Hollow, comprising 412 acres with all structures and appurtenances as described in the trust instrument from the Edmund Aldrich Crane Perpetual Trust to Sable Elise Ashford, great-grandniece of Edmund Aldrich Crane, is hereby approved. I am directing the County Property Office to process the deed transfer within 30 days. The trust assets, including the accumulated revenue in the mineral lease account, will transfer to the claimant's designated account upon completion of the county filing. For the avoidance of doubt, the lineage verification required by the trust's temporal clause is hereby deemed complete as of today's ruling. The county filing is an administrative step outside the scope of the 90-day condition. The gavel came down, day 70 of 90. Cordelia put her hand on Sable's arm. Grail said something that she did not fully hear because there was a sound in her ears that was not external. The particular internal resonance of a large thing arriving. She turned. James Crane Davenport was standing at his table. His lawyers were packing their files. He was not packing anything. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, and then he looked up and he looked at her. This time it lasted longer than a few seconds. She thought about his deposition from 2019, the 40 pages, the long pause, the words he had said when asked why he kept pursuing a claim that had failed 3 times. Because it was supposed to be ours. That is not arrogance, that is history. My father told me, his father told him, it goes back. And you do not just stop because a court says no, you stop when the truth changes. She looked at him across the courtroom. A 71-year-old man who had spent 22 years running towards something his father had told him was coming. 3 court losses, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and a truth that had just changed in a way he could not undo. She thought he is going to lose sleep tonight. She thought he has been losing sleep for 22 years. She thought, I need to talk to him, not today, not while the lawyers are watching, but soon, because the story does not end with a gavel. It ends with what happens after. She walked out of the courthouse into the January cold. The sky had cleared while they were inside, and the light was the particular brilliant flat light of winter afternoons. Everything sharp-edged and precise, under a sky that had stopped equivocating. She stood on the steps for a moment, Cordelia beside her, Grail behind. She thought about the pond at Crane Hollow, the flat stone at the water's edge, worn smooth by the repeated presence of a man who had stood there every morning for decades. She thought about standing on that stone herself, not as a visitor, not as a claimant, as the person it belonged to. She thought about the dead tree at the eastern boundary, still standing, gray and bare, the envelope gone from it now, its job done. And she thought about what came next, which was not a number or a ruling or a piece of paper with a judge's signature. What came next was the harder thing, the longer thing, the thing that would take the rest of her life if she did it right. Learning what 412 acres of hill country and a stone house and a dead man's faith were for. 20 days remained on the clock, but the clock no longer mattered. The verification was complete. The truth had changed, and she was standing on the other side of it for the worthy part 3. The keeper tree. She did not leave the courthouse immediately. Cordelia was already on the steps talking to Grail about the county filing timeline and the trust asset transfer sequence and the particular order of signatures that would need to happen in the next 30 days. The machinery of law doing what machinery does, converting a decision into a process. Converting a process into a result, Sable stood inside the courtroom doorway and watched James Crane Davenport walk toward the side exit with his lawyers flanking him. Aldrich was speaking in a low voice. The other lawyer, the woman, was already on her phone. James was not listening to either of them. He was walking with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floor and the particular gait of a man carrying something heavy that no one else could see. She made a decision. She crossed the courtroom. Her shoes on the limestone floor made a sound that was louder than she expected in the emptying room. James's lawyer saw her coming before James did. Aldrich stopped talking. The woman lowered her phone. They watched her approach with the alert stillness of professionals witnessing something outside their professional framework. James turned. He was taller than she had registered at the distance of two opposing tables. Close up, the lines in his face were deep. The specific depth of outdoor weather and time and a considerable amount of worry. His eyes were brown and clear, and he was looking at her with the expression she had identified at the first hearing, recognition, mixed now with something she had not seen there before, something that was not anger and was not defeat, though it contained elements of both. She said, "I have read your 2019 deposition." He said nothing. She said, "You said you would stop when the truth changed." She paused. She let the pause do its work. Silence between sentences was not empty space. It was load-bearing structure. "I want you to know that I understand what it costs to believe in something for as long as you have believed in this. I am not going to pretend I do not understand that." He was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was almost empty now, just the two of them and his lawyers and the clerk gathering papers at the bench. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "Ruth Ashford's granddaughter." Ruth was Raymond Crane's daughter. She was a practical woman who raised me on soup and hard work and told me once that the Crane blood was proud. She died when I was 16. Something moved through his face. Not a softening exactly, more like a shift in the geology beneath the surface, the kind of movement that takes years to complete but begins in a single moment. He said, "I did not know Raymond had a daughter. The family records did not show it." She said she married young and took her husband's name entirely. She did not stay connected to the Crane side. I think she did not know there was anything to stay connected to. Or if she knew, she did not think it was hers to claim. He looked at her for a long time. The way you look at something you are trying to place. Something that does not fit into the categories you have been using but clearly belongs somewhere. He said, "You really did not know." She said, "I really did not know." Another silence, then he said quietly, the kind of quiet that meant he was saying it to himself as much as to her. 37 years. She said yes. She let that sit. Then she said, "I am going to ask you something and you do not have to answer it." He waited. She said, "Edmund built that property. He worked it his whole life. He left it to whoever found that envelope because he did not trust anyone he knew to care for it the way it deserved." She paused. "I do not know what he saw in the family that made him make that decision, but I think he saw something true. And I think you probably know what it was." James Crane Davenport looked at her for a long time. His lawyers had stopped all pretense of doing anything other than watching. He said, "My father went to see Edmund 6 months before he died. Went to ask him directly about the will, about the estate. He came back and told us everything was arranged. Said Edmund had as good as promised it to the family. Said all the legal details were sorted." He paused. "My father was not a dishonest man in most things, but he was very good at hearing what he wanted to hear." She said, "And you believed him?" He said, "I was 22. He was my father." She nodded. She understood that. The way children believe their parents, not because the evidence supports the belief, but because the alternative is too expensive to consider. The cost of questioning your father's word at 22 is not a fact you can verify. It is a foundation you would have to rebuild. She said, "I will make you a promise." Not because the law requires it, and not because I owe you anything, but because Edmund built something worth keeping and I intend to keep it. And keeping it right means understanding its full history. She looked at him directly. When I have a clearer picture of what this property was and what it should become, I would like to sit down with you, not your lawyers, you, and talk about what you remember about the family and the land and Edmund himself, because you knew the family from the inside and I am coming at it from the outside. And both of those perspectives have things the other one does not. He stared at her. He said, "Why would you do that?" She said, "Because the truth is more complete when more people hold parts of it." He looked at his lawyers, then back at her. He said, "My father said Edmund was the most stubborn man he ever met. Said once he decided something, the mountain moved before Edmund did." She said, "I have read his journal. I believe it." He said, "You have his journal." She said, "I found it in the study, on the shelves." He looked away for a moment. At the courtroom window, the January light coming through flat and cold. He said he kept that journal for years, would not let anyone read it. Said a man's private thoughts were his own business and nobody else's. She said they were his business. They still are, mostly. But some of what he wrote is the kind of thing that deserves to be known, not because it changes anything legally, because it explains something. He said, "What does it explain?" She said, "Why he did it this way, why the tree, why the waiting." She paused. He was not punishing the family. He was trying to find someone who looked at things from the right angle. James was silent. Then he said quietly, "And you do," she said apparently. Something shifted in his face, not resolution, not peace, but the beginning of something that might become both given enough time and enough honesty. He said, "I will think about what you have said." She said, "That is all I am asking." She put out her hand. He looked at it. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and it communicated something that words at that moment could not have carried without breaking. She walked back across the courtroom. Cordelia was waiting at the door with the contained expression of someone who had witnessed something unexpected and was deciding what to make of it. Cordelia said quietly, "That was not in my playbook." Sable said, "I know." Cordelia said it was the right thing. Sable said, "I know that too." They walked out into the January cold together. The 30 days the county property office needed passed in the patient way of bureaucratic processes, each step requiring the previous one to be completed, each signature requiring a preceding signature, the careful architecture of transfer that moved at its own pace regardless of what was happening in the lives affected. During those 30 days, Sable made decisions. Not all of them had to do with the estate directly. Some had to do with who she was going to be inside the life that was arriving. She had spent 2 years in motion, moving away from things, navigating by what she needed to avoid, and now she had to learn to navigate towards something which required a different kind of attention, not the constant low-level alertness of survival, but the slower, more deliberate attention of building. She went to the estate every day during those 30 days. She walked the property in the early morning the way Edmund had written about walking it, at the same hour, in every weather. She stood at the flat stone by the pond and watched the light change across the water's surface, and she began to understand what he had meant about seeing a piece of land at the same hour across every season. The way the light at 7 in the morning in January was different from the light at 7 in the morning in February was different from March and April and all the months that would come after. Not dramatically, not in the way sunsets change, in the quiet way, the incremental way, the way that required presence over time, attendance rather than spectacle. She explored the outbuildings, the barn with its high beams and the particular smell of old hay and timber. One corner of the loft had partially collapsed from water damage where a section of roof had failed, but the rest was sound. The bones were exceptional, as Nolan would later say. She found the workshop behind the main house where Edmund had built furniture for decades. The workbench worn smooth at the edges where his hands and arms had rested through thousands of hours of work. The pegboard with the painted outlines, the hand planes and the chisels and the marking gauges all returned to their exact positions. A man who believed in returning things to where they belonged. She learned the kitchen garden in those weeks, not just the layout but the logic of it. The composting system was elegant in its simplicity, 3 bins in a rotating cycle. The drainage channel ran along the north wall and fed into a collection point that Edmund had used for irrigation during dry summers. The beds were laid out in a pattern she eventually recognized from a book she found on the study shelves. A French potager design adapted for American hill country soil and climate. He had read about it, he had thought about it, he had built it with his hands, and it had lasted decades after his hands stopped working it. On the 23rd day, Cordelia called. The county office finished the filing this morning. The deed transfers formally tomorrow when the record is updated. You will receive a call from Grail with the account details for the trust asset transfer. Sable said thank you for everything. Cordelia said it was a good case, clean and clear, with an ending worth having. She paused. I do not get many of those. On the 24th day, Grail called. He read her the account balance in the flat tone of someone delivering a number they had lived with long enough that its size no longer produced a physical reaction. She wrote it down in her notebook. She looked at it. She put the cap back on the pen. 412,700,000 and change. She said, I need to set up a separate account for the estate's operating costs, a foundation account for charitable work, and a personal account that is distinct from both. Grayle said, I will connect you with the bank's private client division. She said, I prefer to use the local branch on Clement Street. I have been using their ATM. They know my face. A pause. He said, I will call the branch manager. On the 25th day, she went to the estate. She did not go with Lester or with Cordelia or with Grail. She drove the used car she had bought the previous week, a 12-year-old sedan in a color the lot had described as silver, but which was more accurately the color of old dishwater. It ran cleanly and had good tires and cost $6,000 of the first stipend adjustment. She drove alone up Ridgemont Road and turned in at the gate. She had a key. She had always had a key since Lester gave her one during the waiting period, but this time the key meant something different. This time the lock it turned was hers. She parked at the top of the rise, sat for a moment with the engine off. January on 400 acres was a particular kind of quiet. The timber stand was deep and dark at the property's eastern edge. The pond had a skin of ice at the margins, not thick enough to bear weight. Just the day's cold laid over the water's surface like a thought not yet fully formed. The kitchen garden was brown and dormant and still. The stone house sat at the center of the property the way stone houses sit, like they grew there rather than being built, like the ground accepted them. She got out of the car, walked to the house, unlocked the front door, stepped inside. The house smelled the same, cold stone and old wood and the neutral maintenance smell underneath. But it felt different, not through any metaphysical mechanism, through the simple physics of a person being somewhere that was now theirs and the somewhere adjusting to that fact. She walked through the main room, stood at the fireplace. The discoloration above the mantel where something large had hung for years was still there. A ghost in unfaded plaster. She went to the kitchen, put the kettle on the cast iron range. Lester had connected the gas the previous week as part of the pre-transfer preparation. The range lit on the second match, the way all things light when they have been waiting long enough, not with reluctance, with something closer to recognition. While the kettle heated, she stood at the north-facing window and looked at the kitchen garden. She thought about what it would look like in May, June, July. She thought about the soil, dark and deep, worked for decades, ready. She thought about what she would plant and when and in what order, the logic of a kitchen garden, which was a different kind of list than the ones she usually made. Not a list of problems and solutions, a list of intentions arranged in time. The kettle whistled, she made tea, she took the cup to the main room and sat on the floor in front of the fireplace because there was no furniture yet. And she drank the tea and she looked at the room and she let herself be in it. She sat there for a long time. She thought about Edmund sitting in the same room, in whatever chair had occupied that spot, looking at the same fireplace, writing in his journal about the land and the family and the weight of deciding what should come next. She thought about the specific loneliness of a person who has outlived or outgrown everyone around them and finds themselves at the end of a life with the question of what it all meant still open. She thought it meant something. It meant this, not the estate, not the money, the decision, the trust, the envelope on the tree, the act of believing in the face of all evidence that the world was not inclined toward that kind of faith, that the right person would come. She thought, Edmund, you were right. The afternoon light moved across the room, the winter sun tracking its slow arc, the shadows shifting on the stone floor in a way that was slow and deliberate, the kind of light movement you only notice if you are still enough to watch it. She was still enough. She watched it. 2 weeks after the formal transfer, she moved in. She returned the key to room 7 at the Halford Motel on a Tuesday morning. Barbara was at the front desk. The same woman who had handed her the key without questions on a day when questions would have made things worse. Sable set the key on the counter and said thank you. Barbara looked at her and said, "You are welcome." And it was clear from the way she said it that she meant something larger than the room. She meant the not asking, the mercy of a locked door and a hot shower when both had been rare. Barbara picked up the key and put it in the drawer and said, "Good luck out there." And that was all. Sable walked out of the Halford for the last time and drove her old sedan up Ridgemont Road with everything she owned in the back seat, which was not much more than it had been when she had arrived in Harmon County: the fireproof box, her notebook, a bag of clothes she had bought at the second-hand store on Elm Street over the past 2 months, the journal she had taken from the shelf and would return when she was done with it, except she was not done and was not sure she would be. A mattress she had bought, plain and good, strapped to the roof of the sedan with bungee cords in a way that was not elegant but was functional. She carried the mattress up the stairs alone and set it directly on the hardwood floor of the master bedroom because she had not bought a frame yet and was not in a hurry to. The room was large, larger than any room she had ever slept in. The windows faced east, toward the timber stand and the fence line, and beyond the fence line, though she could not see it from the bedroom window, the dead tree. She also brought the $4.37, still unspent, still separate from the account that now held more money than she could conceptualize. She put the coins and the worn bills in the tin box from the underpass and set the tin box on the nightstand in the master bedroom, where she could see it when she woke up, not as a reminder of where she had been, as evidence of what had carried her. That money had survived Wade, had survived the plant closing and the shelter and the drainage ditch and the 11 days. It had sat in a sock and then a tin box and then a jacket pocket while the world broke apart around it and reformed into something unrecognizable. $4.37 that had not been spent because she had been saving them for an emergency she could not define. And now the emergency had turned out to be not a catastrophe but an arrival. And the money was still there, waiting to become something else when she was ready. She lay in the dark on the first night and listened to the house. Old houses had sounds. The timber settling as the temperature dropped, a low creak from somewhere deep in the structure, the wind finding a gap near the east chimney and making a tone that was not quite a whistle, more like breath, the rose on the trellis outside its stems moving against the wood. She listened. She thought, this is mine, not in the way of possession, in the way of belonging, the way a place and a person find each other, sometimes through inheritance, sometimes through purchase, and sometimes through the specific accident of being the person who stops at the right tree on the right morning. She slept. She did not dream about the tree. This time she dreamed about Ruth. They were eating soup and it was good soup, the real kind, the kind that took hours to make. And Ruth looked at her across the table and said something Sable could not quite hear. She leaned forward to hear it. The dream shifted. Ruth was gone, and the bowl was empty, and the room was full of morning light. She woke up, she lay for a moment in the quiet house. Then she said out loud to no one in particular, "I know, Ruth. I am being careful." The first weeks at Crane Hollow were an education in the specific demands of 412 acres. The property had been maintained at a minimum level by the Property Services Company for decades. Maintained meaning the pipes did not freeze and the roof did not collapse and the brush along the road frontage was cut back twice a year. But there is a distance between maintained and love that is as wide as the distance between a house and a home. She began learning what the property needed the same way she had learned everything else in her life. By looking at it, by walking it, by standing in one place long enough to see what was actually there rather than what she expected to see. The barn needed the most work. The collapsed loft section had allowed water to reach the main floor, and the damage had spread along the east wall. The workshop was in better shape, but the roof needed attention. The kitchen garden was dormant under winter, but she could see the bones of it clearly. The structure Edmund had built was still there. The beds, the drainage, the composting system, all of it waiting for someone to start again. She made lists, different lists now, not the lists of a person surviving, the lists of a person building. They had a different quality to them. Survival lists were reactive. Building lists were intentional. Survival lists said, "What do I need today?" Building lists said, "What do I want this to become?" In March, she hired 3 people. The first was a woman named Vera, who was 60 and had been gardening professionally in the county for 30 years. Vera walked the kitchen garden on the day she came for her interview. She walked it slowly. She crouched and took a handful of soil and held it and turned it and let it fall through her fingers. She looked at the beds and the drainage and the composting system. She looked at the south wall where the espaliered fruit trees had gone wild but were still alive, still producing, still holding on to the structure someone had trained them into decades ago. She said only one thing: "This soil is extraordinary. Someone took great care of it." That was when Sable knew she was right. The second was a carpenter named Nolan, who was 43 and quiet and had been recommended by Lester. Nolan walked through the house and the outbuildings with the particular attention of someone who reads structure the way some people read books. He looked at joints and load paths and the grain direction of beams and the way foundations had settled over decades. At the end of the walkthrough, he said, "The bones are exceptional. This will be straightforward work." The third was a young woman named Bridget, who was 20 and had grown up on a farm outside Harmon County. She came to work in the kitchen garden because she had read the job listing which Sable had written herself and posted at the feed store and the hardware store and the community board at the library. Bridget had written back on a piece of notebook paper that she had been looking for exactly this kind of work without knowing that this kind of work existed. Sable had read that note and thought about herself at 20, about looking for something without knowing what it was, and she had called Bridget the same day. By April, the kitchen garden was turned and amended and showing the first green of the season. Vera had been right about the soil. The things they put in came up fast and strong, coming up in ground that has been loved for a long time, ground that remembers how. Vera taught Bridget, and Bridget learned with the particular hunger of someone who has found the thing they are supposed to do. She came early, she stayed late, she asked questions that showed she was not just learning tasks but learning systems. How the composting cycle connected to the soil health, connected to the plant, spacing connected to the water management, connected back to the composting cycle. Everything a circle, everything feeding everything else. By May, Nolan had repaired the collapsed outbuilding and was working on the barn interior, rebuilding the lofting system with timber from the property's own stand. He milled the wood himself using a portable sawmill he brought on a trailer. The lumber was green and would need to season, but it was the right wood from the right place, and he said that mattered. He said a building should be made from where it stands. He said Edmond would have agreed with that, and Sable thought he probably would have. By June, Bridget had learned the kitchen garden's logic, had understood the rotation system Edmund had designed, had begun expanding it south along the wall in a way that preserved the original structure and extended it naturally, the way a sentence extends when you understand the grammar of what came before. Sable spent time at the pond most mornings. She stood on the flat stone at the water's edge, the stone worn smooth by Edmund's presence over decades. She watched the light and she thought about what he had written in the journal about understanding a piece of land by seeing it at the same hour every day across every season. She had started in October. Through winter, she had watched the ice form and the light go flat and gray and then brilliant on clear mornings when the frost caught the sun and turned the shoreline into something that looked like it had been painted with a fine brush. Through spring, she had watched the ice recede and the water clear and the first green appear at the edges of the pond where the cattails grew. Now in summer, the water was warm and dark and full of life, and the light on its surface at 7 in the morning was the color of old gold. She understood now what Edmund had meant. The pond was not the same pond from season to season. It was the same water in the same place, but it was not the same thing. Because a thing is not just its components, a thing is also the light on it and the time of year and the person looking at it and what they bring to the looking. She brought something different now than she had brought in October. She brought the accumulation of 8 months of standing in the same place and watching it change. In May, she had walked the south slope for the first time with real attention. She had been up there before during the early walkthrough with Lester and again several times during the 30 days of waiting. But walking a piece of land with ownership changes what you see. The south slope caught the morning sun first and held it longest. The soil was different up there, lighter, rockier, the kind of soil that does not hold water but does hold warmth, and warmth was what fruit trees needed. She found the remains of the orchard scattered across the slope in a pattern that was hard to read until she found Edmund's planting map in a file cabinet in the study. He had drawn the orchard by hand on graph paper, each tree marked with a small circle and a name. 20 trees in 4 rows of 5 staggered for light. She laid the map over the slope and counted what was left. 4 trees still alive and producing their branches heavy and unpruned, but still bearing fruit from sheer biological stubbornness. 8 stumps in various states of decay where trees had died and been cut or had fallen. And 8 empty spaces where trees had simply vanished, reclaimed by the ground they had grown from. The 4 surviving trees were all on the eastern half of the slope, where the natural windbreak of the timber stand gave some shelter. She pruned them carefully in April with Vera's guidance. Vera said, "You do not prune an old fruit tree the way you prune a young one. A young tree you shape for the future. An old tree you prune to honor what it has already decided to become. You take the dead wood and the crossing branches and you leave the rest alone." Sable thought about that. She thought about it often. In June, James Crane Davenport called. He called on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden pulling the first summer radishes. She sat on an overturned bucket in the middle of the garden and talked to him for 40 minutes. He asked about the house. She told him about the kitchen range and the north-facing windows and the shelf where Edmund had calibrated the spacing to his specific preserving jars. He was quiet for a moment after that. He said, "I remember those jars. I was at the house once when I was young, maybe 12. Edmund had the pantry full of them. He made everything himself, preserves, pickles, everything. My mother said it was eccentric. A man doing that kind of work, he said it was practical." She said the jar on the shelf, the one labeled September preserves, is that what he called them? He said that is what he called them. September was the best preserving month. He had opinions about it. She said, "Do you know what was in them?" He said, "Apple butter mostly." He had an orchard on the south slope, 20 trees. You probably found the remains of it. She said, I found 4 trees that are still producing. Vera thinks there is a fifth that might come back if we work on it this fall. A pause, longer than the others. He said there was a particular tree, the one closest to the fence on the southeast corner. Edmund called it the keeper. Said it made better fruit than the rest because it had the most weather, got the most sun, the most wind, the most cold. He said the fruit that grows in difficulty is sweeter than the fruit that grows easy. She sat in the summer garden with the radishes in her hand and the phone against her ear and let that sit, without rushing to fill the silence with interpretation. She said, I will find it. She did. She found the keeper tree the following week on the southeast corner of where the orchard had been, a gnarled and heavy-branched apple tree that was already setting fruit in July. Early, ahead of the other 3, as if it had been waiting to be recognized and was going ahead without permission. She stood under it, put her hand on the bark, thought about difficulty making things sweeter, thought about the drainage ditch, thought about 11 days on the ground and the years before that, the plant and the shelter and weight and the circle that ate itself. She thought, I know something about that. In July, she began reading about orchard restoration. She found 3 books on Edmund's shelves that covered the subject. He had underlined passages and made notes in the margins in his small, careful hand. She read his notes alongside the text, and it was like having a conversation with someone across 40 years of distance. He would underline a passage about pruning technique and write in the margin, yes, but not the lower branches, and she would go out to the keeper tree and look at the lower branches and understand what he meant. She ordered rootstock from a nursery upstate, 15 trees to replant the south slope, the same varieties Edmund had grown. She found the records in a file cabinet in the study. He had kept meticulous notes on every tree: variety, planting date, first fruiting year, average yield, pest issues. He had given each tree a name, not human names, descriptive names: the keeper, the leaner south corner, gate view. He had known each tree the way you know the person you see every day for decades. She planted the new trees in October with Vera and Bridget helping. 15 holes dug in the south slope in positions she had chosen based on Edmund's original planting map, adjusted for the way the ground had shifted and settled over the decades since the original orchard went in. She planted the keeper variety closest to the southeast fence, where the original stood, where the weather was hardest, where the fruit would be sweetest. James came to the estate for the first time in September. He came alone, no lawyers, as she had asked. He drove himself in a truck that was old and clean, the truck of a man who maintained his equipment because maintenance was a value rather than a chore. He pulled in at the gate and she was already there waiting, because she had asked him to come at 9. And it was 5 to 9, and she had learned in the past months that being early to things that mattered was another form of paying attention. He got out of the truck. He stood at the gate. He looked at the property. She let him look. He stood there for a long time, looking at the house on the rise, the stone and timber, the covered porch, the chimneys at each end, the kitchen garden visible to the south, green and ordered and in full summer abundance, the oaks beyond the house still in their September foliage, the gold just starting at the edges of the leaves, the pond catching the morning light. She watched his face. She had been watching people's faces her whole life, the way people watch faces when they do not have many other things to read, when the face is the primary text available, and she had gotten good at it. She watched his face and saw what she had been watching for since the courtroom. The truth changing, not the legal truth, that had changed in January. The internal truth, the truth that lived in the part of a person below reason, below argument, in the part formed before you were old enough to question it. That truth was slower to change. It needed evidence of a different kind, not documents and lineage authentication, evidence of care, evidence of attention, evidence that the person who had this thing was going to be the kind of person who deserved it. They walked the property for 2 hours. She showed him the kitchen garden, the expansion along the south wall, the rotation system restored to its original design. He looked at it carefully. At one point, he crouched down and took a handful of soil and held it, turned it over, let it fall through his fingers, the same thing Vera had done on her first visit. The instinct of someone who knows that the first thing you do with land is touch it. He said, I do not know much about gardening, but I know this is good soil. She said, Vera says someone took exceptional care of it for decades. He said Edmund spent more time in this garden than anywhere else on the property near the end. Said it was the honest work, that everything you put in you got back. She thought about that. She thought about 37 years of mineral lease revenue compounding. She thought about a trust that returned to its bearer, everything Edmund had put into it over a lifetime. She thought he was not just talking about the garden. She showed him the workshop. He stood at Edmund's workbench with his hands on the worn edge and said nothing for a while, just looked at the hand planes on the pegboard, still in their painted outlines. Everyone returned to its exact position. He said, my father told me Edmund made all the furniture in the house himself. Every piece. Said it was more stubbornness than skill, but the furniture lasted. She said Nolan has been repairing the barn with timber from the property stand. He uses the same approach, works with what is here rather than bringing in what is not. James ran his hand along the workbench edge, along the smooth place where Edmund's hands had rested for decades. He said whoever built this property knew what they were doing. She said yes, he did. She took him to the pond last. They stood at the flat stone at the water's edge. The September light was coming off the water at the particular angle she had been watching for 11 months now. The one that changed by the hour and by the season and was never quite the same twice. He stood beside her. He said, I used to fish this pond when I was a boy. Edmund never stocked it. Said the land provided what it provided and it was not your place to improve on it. She said, I have been thinking about building a dock, not a big one, just enough to sit on at this hour, watch the light. He looked at the water. He said that is where he used to sit. On that stone, every morning before 7, rain or shine. He said if you wanted to understand a piece of land, you had to see it at the same hour every day across every season. She said, I have been doing that since October. He said, all seasons. She said, winter, spring, summer, and now fall. I have not missed a morning. He was quiet for a long time. The water moved slightly in the September breeze, the light breaking and reforming across the surface. He said he would have said, you are the right person. She said, I think he did say that. In 1986, he just did not know my name yet. James made a sound that was close to a laugh, not a full laugh, but the beginning of one, the beginning of something his face had not done in a long time. Then the sound faded and he was quiet again, and she knew the moment had arrived. The thing she had been waiting for since June. The rest of the story. She could feel it in the way his shoulders changed, the way the weight he had been carrying reorganized itself into something that needed to come out. He said, I need to tell you something. She waited. He said, after the trial, I went home and I sat with it for a long time, weeks. I was angry at first. Then I was not angry. Then I was something else that I did not have a word for. And I started going through my father's things, boxes in the attic I had not opened since he died, papers and letters and the kind of things a man keeps when he does not know what else to do with the evidence of his own history. He paused. I found a letter, not the 1985 letter, a different one. Edmund wrote it to Aldous Pemberton, his lawyer. It was dated 6 months before Edmund died. It described a visit from my father. Sable did not move. James said my father did not just ask about the will. He threatened Edmund. He told Edmund that if the estate did not go to the family, he would petition the court to have Edmund declared mentally incompetent. He would bring doctors. He would bring witnesses. He would use the trust instrument itself as evidence of diminished capacity. He told Edmund he would make the last year of his life a legal nightmare. He stopped, he looked at the pond. Edmund did not argue with him, did not raise his voice, did not threaten back. He showed my father to the door, and 1 week later he met with Aldous Pemberton, and they finalized the trust instrument, the envelope, the tree, all of it, 1 week after my father walked into his house and threatened to take everything from him. The September morning was very still. The light on the water did not move. James said my father never told me that part. He told me Edmund had promised. He told me it was arranged. He told me the story he needed me to believe so that I would spend my life fighting for something he knew he had already lost. He paused. I kept that letter for 15 years without reading it. It was in a box in my attic. I knew it was there. I knew what it might contain. And I did not read it because I was afraid of what I would find. She said, "What made you read it now?" He said, "You, standing in that courtroom, crossing the room to shake my hand after you had just won everything and I had just lost everything. Nobody does that. Nobody walks toward the person they just defeated and offers them understanding. And I thought if she can do that, then I can open a box in my attic and read what is inside it." She looked at the pond. She thought about Edmund, 87 years old, sitting in this house after his nephew had threatened to destroy him, not retaliating, not despairing, walking to his lawyer's office and building something instead. A trust that would outlast the threat, an envelope that would outlast the family's anger, a dead tree that would hold a message until the right person came. She said he was not punishing anyone. James said no, he was not. She said he was protecting the land. James said yes. From us, the honesty of that sentence sat between them like something heavy and clean. The weight of a man admitting at 71 that the thing he had spent his adult life pursuing had never been his, and that the person who had kept it from him had been right to do so. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said it was time. They stood at the pond for a while longer. The light shifted. The September morning aged into something warmer. A pair of birds crossed the water low and fast, their reflections skimming the surface like shadows of themselves. She said, "You are welcome here, whenever you want to come. Not as a guest, as someone who belongs to this place's history." He looked at the water for a long time. Then he nodded, once. The way he had nodded in the courtroom after the first hearing. The nod of a person processing something rather than reacting to it. In October, she broke ground on the foundation, not a building, a charitable organization, incorporated with Cordelia's help and named after her grandmother, the Ruth Ashford Foundation. The foundation's purpose was specific. She had written the founding document herself in the plain, direct prose her grandmother had used for important things. To provide transitional housing, legal assistance, and documentary support to people experiencing homelessness who have legitimate claims on property inheritance or benefits they lack the resources or knowledge to access. People in drainage ditches, people without phones and without lawyers, people who had found something or were owed something or deserved something and could not reach it because the distance between having a right and exercising a right was measured in dollars they did not have. Grail had read the founding document and said this is what Edmund intended, not necessarily this specific form, but this direction. She said, "I know. I read his journal, March 3rd. He said, you know that entry." She said worth and for are different questions. Most people stop at worth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Aldous had the journal photocopied in 1995 for the trust file. He thought it was relevant context. She said Aldous was thorough. He said he learned it from Edmund. In November, James came back. He did not call ahead. He pulled up to the gate on a Tuesday morning and she saw his truck from the kitchen window while she was making breakfast, and she went out to meet him. He had a box in his hands. He said these were in my father's things. After my father died, I kept them. I did not know what else to do with them. She took the box. Inside were photographs. decades of them, black and white and early color, and the particular saturated quality of photographs from the 1970s. The house as it had been, the orchard in full bloom, 20 trees on the south slope, their spring flowering so heavy the branches bent, the kitchen garden in summer abundance, the pond in winter with a proper freeze, and one photograph that made her stop. A man standing on the ice in the center of the pond, arms out, laughing. She picked it up. She said, "Is this Edmund?" James said, 1962, he was 63. He skated on that pond every winter that it froze hard enough. Had opinions about how to test the ice. She looked at the photograph. A man at 63 in 1962, arms out on a frozen pond, laughing. The particular joy of a person fully in a place, fully present, fully alive to the specific quality of a winter morning on a pond he had known for decades. She said, "Will you show me how to test ice?" What he knew about this property that is not in any document, everything you saw here as a boy and remember. She held up the box, everything that goes with these photographs. He looked at the box. He said that could take a while. She said, "I am not in a hurry." He looked at the property, the November trees, the last of the leaves still holding, the stone house on the rise, the pond just visible through the oaks, cold and silver under the gray November sky. He said, "I will come back." She said, "I know you will." He drove out. She stood at the gate with the box of photographs in her arms and watched the truck until it turned off Richmond Road and was gone. She looked east along the fence line. The dead tree was still there. She had not touched it, had not cut it down or cleared it, even though the groundwork along the eastern boundary had given her reason to. She had left it because it was Edmund's marker, his chosen place, the specific tree he had watched go gray in 1982 and trusted to hold what he needed to leave. She walked to it, put her hand on the bark, still gray, still bare, still standing, the roots buckled into their pattern of cracked ridges, the branches reaching in every direction with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time and was not finished waiting yet. She thought you did your job. She thought, "Thank you." She stood there for a moment longer, then she turned and walked back up the path, past the kitchen garden and the apple trees and the workshop with Edmund's tools in their painted outlines, up to the stone house at the top of the rise, and she went inside. She put the box of photographs on the kitchen table. She put the kettle on the range. She looked out the north window at the kitchen garden. Dormant now in November, the soil turned and covered and waiting for spring, which was still months away and already certain. She had kept the $4.37. She had thought about spending them many times during the months since the hearing on something small and specific, a marking of the before and after, but every time she thought about spending it, she found she was not ready. And she had learned to trust that feeling, the feeling of not yet, the feeling that the money was waiting for its own right moment. She spent it in October. She bought a small jar of local honey from the farmer's market on the Harmon County Town Square. The vendor was an older man who kept bees on his property east of town and sold his honey in jars labeled by season: spring blossom, summer clover, autumn wild. She bought the autumn wild, $3 even. She got $1.37 in change, and she put the coins in her pocket, and they sat there for the rest of the afternoon, lighter than the 4.37 had been. Lighter because they were remainder, because the original amount had done what it was meant to do. It had become something, not an emergency, a choice. She carried the jar home to Crane Hollow. She put it on the kitchen shelf next to the jar of September preserves and the beeswax candle she had bought with the first of the money. She stood at the shelf and looked at the three objects. A jar of preserves made by a man who had been dead for 37 years. A candle made from the wax of bees that lived on land she now owned, and a jar of honey bought with the last of the money she had hidden in a sock and saved from a life that no longer existed. She said out loud to the kitchen and to the north-facing windows and to the morning light coming through them, "Ruth, this is what you send me toward. I want you to know I see it." The kitchen was quiet. The light moved across the stone floor, slow and specific and indifferent and beautiful. She took out the box of photographs that James had brought. She spread them on the kitchen table one by one. Edmund on the frozen pond, the orchard in bloom, the kitchen garden in its summer fullness, the house in a photograph that must have been taken the year it was built. Everything new and raw and beginning, the stone not yet softened by decades of weather, the timber not yet darkened, the land around it not yet knowing the shape of its own life with the house in it. She looked at that photograph for a long time. She thought about beginnings. She thought about the specific beginning she was in, which was not the same as starting over, because you did not start over from zero. You started from where you were, which was a drainage ditch and a dead tree and a grandmother who said the crane blood was proud. And all of those things were not behind her. They were inside her, carried the way you carry the things that made you. She put the kettle on again. She made more tea. She carried it to the main room and sat in front of the fireplace which she had laid that morning and lit when she came inside. The wood caught and the room filled with the warmth of a fire in a stone house. The warmth that comes from every direction at once because the stone holds it and gives it back slowly. The warmth that Edmund had known every winter for decades, the warmth she would know now. She thought about what she owed. She owed the land its future. She owed Edmund's faith its completion. She owed Ruth the proof that the crane blood was what she said it was. Proud, stubborn, the kind that does not ask for things because it does not need to. She thought, I will take care of it. I will learn what it is for. I will stand at the pond at the same hour every day, across every season. I will find the keeper tree every September and understand what the difficulty in the growing makes sweeter. I will build a dock. I will restore the orchard. I will fill the shelves with September preserves and autumn honey and the evidence of a life lived in full attention to the specific quality of a place. She thought, I will be what you trusted the universe to send. She thought about James driving home in his old clean truck with the weight on his shoulders a little lighter than it had been. She thought about Cordelia at her desk with her reading glasses and her precise handwriting and her bookshelves that held up the wall. She thought about Grail closing the folder that had been open for 32 years. She thought about Rowan in his too large sweater and Barbara at the Halford front desk and Vera's hands in the soil, and Nolan reading the grain of timber, and Bridget arriving early and staying late and learning the grammar of the garden. She thought about all of them, all the people who had held parts of the truth at different times and in different ways, all the people who had carried something forward without knowing exactly where it was going. She thought about Ruth saying the name once, over soup, to a 9-year-old. She thought about Edmund nailing an envelope to a tree. She thought about herself, 23 years old, sleeping in a drainage ditch with $4.37 and a habit of looking at things from odd angles. 3 people, 3 decisions, 3 acts of faith separated by decades and connected by a piece of land that rolled through hill country with intention. Outside, the November wind moved through the property, through the oaks and the apple trees and the timber stand, through the kitchen garden's dormant beds, past the pond and the flat stone at its edge, along the eastern fence line, through the bare and patient branches of the dead tree that had held an envelope for 37 years and given it to the right person when she came. The fire burned, the house held, she stayed.